Today we are at the Tower of London, oddly enough, and our intention is to interview Dave Phillips. Now, Dave is a beefeater, a yeoman warder, and has been here for 17 years, and he's a good friend. I've known him for some considerable time, probably most of that 17 years, to be honest with you. Dave, thanks so much for having me in your lovely house, Grade 1 listed. I've never interviewed anybody in a Grade 1 listed building before.
Yeah, it's something very special. And in fact, this house is particularly special because it's the only home in the Tower of London where a yeoman warder has been killed during active service. The only yeoman warder ever killed.
Really? In this very building?
In this home, yeah.
Wow.
A man called yeoman warder Samuel Reeves was killed in October 1941 by the Luftwaffe. The building took a direct hit.
Wow. Well, it's been done up well since then, I've got to say.
Do you like what I've done with the place?
So, Dave, you've been here 17 years, but prior to that, you've had a distinguished military career. But you were originally born in the East End of London.
Yes, I'm a Hackney boy. Grew up in sort of Stoke Newington, Dalston, that sort of area. And then left there when I was 16 to join the army.
Boy soldier?
Yeah. Joined the Royal Irish Rangers in May 1979 and went immediately over to Ballymena in Northern Ireland to do my training. And as of course, as a boy soldier, spent a year in Ballymena.
How was that at that time? I mean, 79, we were getting busy out there. Your Bobby Sands and the like were just getting ready to go on the hunger strikes. How was that?
Very interesting. One of the funny things about it is, like most people, I expected to be trained before going to Northern Ireland. And there I am as a 16-year-old boy jumping on a ferry to go from Liverpool to Belfast. And I get picked up by armed soldiers and taken to my new barracks. And of course, for the first 3 months, the first term, we were confined to camp. But from the second and third term, we were allowed out. And walking around the streets with an East London accent, short hair, some interesting times.
Yeah, you were only ever going to be a squaddy, weren't you, at the end of the day? So be wandering around looking like that and sounding like that, you weren't going to be there as a tourist.
No, I think to be fairly, I got away with it because at 16 years of age, I looked about 14. I was a skinny little runt. And of course, people probably looked at me and thought, there's no way he's a soldier, he's too young. And of course, on weekends off, I couldn't come home to London. So I would go off to friends' homes all around the various parts of Northern Ireland. So I walked around Belfast as a 16-year-old, going into pubs with friends.
Fascinating. I like Belfast. I've been out there playing hockey with the police against the RUC. Different time then. It was when it was the RUC. And we got to see some really interesting places. So how long were you in Northern Ireland for your training?
A year. It was a whole year. As a junior soldier, went for a whole year. Then we had a couple of weeks leave and then went off to our units.
And where was your unit based?
I was based at the time in Tidworth, down in Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
So that was my first couple of years in the battalion. And of course, once you hit the battalion, I joined the 2nd Battalion Royal Irish Rangers. You then start your continuation training, which eventually led me into support weapons, anti-tank weapons.
Wow. So what does that mean? Anti-tank weapons, you're talking about, I don't know, armour piercing.
Well, in my day, sounds really old. But when I first joined the anti-tanks, we were in Tidworth and we had a wheeled 120mm gun. So a recoilless gun, 120mm, and it fired a Hess round, high explosive squash head, out to a range of about 1,500 metres. Very good fun, crewed by 4 men. And we were basically deployed to destroy tanks, to destroy any armour in the battlefield. Later on in life, I moved on to Wombat when we moved out to Berlin. Similar weapon, but a slightly different version of it. That's more vehicle-based, so it's mounted on a Land Rover.
And belt-fed?
No, all single shot. I mean, 120 120mm round, weighs about 60 pounds.
My life.
So all of a sudden, I started getting bigger and stronger because I was lumping 60-pound shells around.
Oh my word! That is quite a lump as well. Where do you go to from there?
Well, from Tidworth, I was deployed on several overseas exercises for normally 6 weeks at a time. So I went out to Gibraltar, Canada, and America. and several exercises over in Germany. And then in 1981, we were deployed to Berlin for 2 years as part of the garrison.
And what did you do in Berlin? What were your prime functions there?
Primary role was the defence of Berlin should the Russians attack come over the wall. And because I was anti-tanks, we had pre-deployment positions where we would deploy around protecting bridges, main roads, generally protecting the bridges whilst the Royal Engineers blew them up to stop the Russians coming across them and getting easily across the Havel River. And obviously slowing tanks down by taking out command vehicles, lead tanks. And of course, one of my many duties over there was guarding Spandau Prison. And at the time, there was only one prisoner in there, prisoner number 7, Rudolf Hess.
Number 7. How did he get number 7?
Well, the Russians gave them all numbers because they didn't want to give them the dignity of using their name.
Right.
And of course, as all the other prisoners died off or were released under ill health or put into other prisons, Hess was the last one left.
And there's a direct link between what you do now and that particular role, because he landed in the UK in 1941. So 41 years beforehand.
Yeah.
He was landing in the UK, broke his leg, I think, as he landed and said he was here to send the Führer's good wishes and wanted to take over the country.
Trying to broker a peace deal with Lord Hamilton up in Scotland. So he flew his own Messerschmitt into Scotland, couldn't find Dunraven House that he was looking for, eventually running out of fuel, parachuted down, injured his leg and was captured and was taken away. He was originally captured by a farmer who took him to the farmhouse and then called the police. Police arrived and Rudolf Hess is sitting there drinking a cup of coffee with the farmer's wife. Sorry, a cup of tea in those days. And he was then taken away to the military, gave a false name, and it was actually one of the officers in the garrison realised who it was. And then, of course, everything starts to kick off. And from that, he was brought down here to London and placed in our prisoner of war collection centre. So he lived in the King's House at the Tower of London.
Wow. And that was specifically furnished for, if Adolf Hitler had been captured, that's where he was going to be placed.
Yeah, absolutely. He was going to be brought here, placed into the King's House, and then eventually I think the correct term today is he would be questioned by the intelligence services.
Yeah, I think it's slightly different. Interesting enough, a friend of ours who lives in France now, her grandfather was Lord Sandhurst, and he was one of the people that MI8, which was the military intercept team, that the radio hams basically, and then the double cross element and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating, and the interrogations used to take place either at Kensington Palace Gardens in the house there, or at Wormwood Scrubs. And if they didn't tell the truth, then they'd be executed. And if they did tell the truth, they'd probably be executed as well.
I mean, we had the intelligence services here at the Tower of London listening to the prisoners of war.
Oh, wow.
And they actually put undercover operatives in with the prisoners, dressed as German prisoners who were obviously fluent German speakers, many of whom were German. And there were recording devices in the rooms where they were held, mainly down in the Salt Tower.
So we're in 1981, did you say?
Yes.
1981. I mean, the interesting thing is we're talking 41 years ago that happened.
Yeah.
And if you take 1981 back to 41 years, you're talking about 1940. We're just getting ready for the Blitz and everything else that was going on. But 1981 seems like only yesterday.
Yeah, to me it does. It doesn't seem that long ago I was working in Berlin.
So what was it like? You've got the most iconic, notorious prisoner in the world at that time.
Yeah. What
was that like working at Spandau Prison?
It was really strange because in the 2 years, I probably guarded Hess on 7 or 8 occasions, and it was a 24-hour duty in Spandau Prison. And at the time, I was a young private soldier, or ranger as we were known, and then got promoted to Lance Corporal. So my duties varied depending on my rank. And most of the time, it was just a simple case of collecting him from his accommodation. And I say accommodation because although he lived in a cell block, it was open and he could walk down the corridors, he could make a cup of coffee, make a bit of a sandwich or something. So it wasn't really incarcerated in a cell. He had a whole wing to himself. And it was just a case of taking him out of the cell. He would then go out and walk around the grounds. And he had a summer house where he would paint, draw, write poetry. And wherever he went, 4 of us had to guard him. And it's really strange because all those years later I come to the Tower of London, and when Her Majesty or His Majesty arrive at the Tower of London, 4 of us escort the King or Queen. And all of a sudden I'm doing this with a Nazi war criminal.
Did he engage with you whilst you were there?
He did, but not a great deal. He would speak to us. He wouldn't discuss anything about the Second World War, the Nazi Party, and we weren't allowed to talk about anything to do with current affairs because he basically was kept in solitary confinement. He didn't know what was happening in the world. Now, having said that, he had a radio, which he used to listen to. Until the Russians took turns in guarding him, they would take everything off him. So they would take away his radio, his writing materials, reading materials. So he really hated it when the Russians took over the duties because they treated him very badly.
And what was the turnaround? Because British Army, Russian military, and the American military was that
French
and the French.
Yeah. So we all took it in turns, and there was no set pattern. It wasn't like you went and did 2 weeks. It was always a sort of varied pattern for security reasons. You didn't want to say, right, the French are now going to be on for 2.5 weeks. Then the Russians will take over, then the British. And there was always a big ceremony for the handover between the different nations. And of course, when the British Army were on duty, we would have 3 battalions of infantry soldiers and we would all take it in turns. So it wouldn't necessarily be the Irish Rangers on for 2.5 weeks. It would be us or one of the other regiments. And it was always switched around to stop the boredom and to stop the routines from becoming the same. So when we were on duty there, I might do one duty and never do another one for 5 or 6 months.
Permanently armed as well, whilst you're there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And was there any risk to him whilst he was in there, other than from the outside sources? Was there any actual risk?
Not really a risk. The main reason we were there was to guard anyone from trying to break in.
Right.
Because by the time I got there, he was an old, infirm, 83-year-old man on a walking stick. There's no way he was going to tunnel out, climb over the walls. But it was always a fear that Nazi sympathisers would try and break in to rescue him. So it was more of us guarding people from coming in than prisoners getting out.
Fascinating.
Really strange times.
Yeah. And of course, what year did he pass away?
1987.
87.
Yeah, he took his own life.
Did he?
Yeah. In the small summer house I spoke about earlier on, he used the flex off a radiator to hang himself.
Wow. And the Russians were looking after him at that particular time, weren't they?
The French were looking after him. Yeah, so of course what you've now got is there's lots of conspiracy theorists who believe that he was murdered.
Yeah.
Because several times throughout his incarceration, particularly as he started getting infirm, the 4 superpowers would get together and agree that isn't it time that he was put into another prison, because keeping a prison for one man is pretty ridiculous and it's manpower intensive. I mean, we had a platoon of 30 men guarding that prison 24/7. Same with the French, same with the Americans, similar numbers. Strangely, when the Russians came over, they would have between 40 and 60 men. Now, I've got no doubt in my mind, and anybody thinking about it, that probably half of those were Spetsnaz or they were KGB in military uniforms, because they're now in West Berlin. And of course, when they're off duty, you can walk around West Berlin in uniform, spying.
Yeah.
And of course, you can't be accused of spying because you are very obviously a Russian soldier. You're in Russian uniform. And it was pretty much the same when we went to East Berlin. We went in uniform. And of course, if he was released and put into another prison, that then took away their time in West Berlin guarding Spandau. And one of the things that I remember being talked about was they said that if he ever died in their hands, they would build a memorial and they would come and guard the memorial. And it was the memorial for the Russian soldiers that had worked in West Berlin guarding the prison, not a memorial to Rudolf Hess. So, of course, that gave them their ticket into the West.
They had license to do what they wanted to.
Absolutely. And fortunately, he died in our hands, or French hands, and within 24 hours, the prison was gone. It was completely demolished within 24 hours and dumped at sea.
Really?
Yeah, because they were worried about, again, Nazi souvenir hunters coming to take a brick from Spandau Prison. So it was completely gone. And within a few months, there was a new supermarket being built, a Russian supermarket on the site, which the squaddies referred to as Hesco's.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it's a real shame because we were talking earlier on as a kid. I remember my dad served all over the world and we at one point lived in Munster. But the British Army don't get those opportunities anymore, do they? No. They don't get to go. I think they might do soon, actually, depending on what happens in the Ukraine. I think they're going to start I think they'll have to start re-establishing bases on mainland Europe. But yes, it's a real shame because the opportunities aren't there.
No, there's certainly not as many, and there's not as many soldiers anymore.
No.
We're down to an army of 80,000, I think is the current figures. When I was in it was 300,000. So, of course, most of those were deployed during the Cold War, waiting for the Russians to come over the border.
Yeah.
And when we've shrunk down, the Russians now come over the border.
Yeah, absolutely. And, interesting days ahead. Certainly, I think that the Poles haven't covered themselves in glory by announcing it was a genuine mistake that, the surface-to-air missiles or whatever landed in Poland, killing 2 people, right on the border, killing 2 people, and they said it was a mistake, but only time will tell. So what happens next in Dave Phillips' life? You're still a young soldier, young private, Lance Corporal out in Berlin. Where did you go to from there?
From Berlin, I was promoted while I was there to Lance Corporal, having done my promotion course. And we then deployed back to the UK. I was sent to Dover for 5 years.
Shorncliffe Barracks, folks?
No, actually in Dover. Yeah, right next to Dover Castle. There's a barracks there. No longer exists. I think there's a housing estate there now.
Right.
But that was sort of a home posting for 5 years, during which time I went off and did various operations, exercises, and my first deployment as a soldier to Northern Ireland. In 1984, I went off to South Armagh for
proper bandit country.
Yeah, proper bandit country. Yeah.
How was that for you? I mean, this is you were training there. You've now gone back as a full-time, fully operational soldier. How was that?
It was a very, very intense tour because we were right at the height of the Troubles, bombs, snipers, and everything all over the place. And as you say, known as bandit country. Really tough times, and operationally very hard. I mean, we were out on the ground most of the time, and if we weren't on the ground, we're in camp waiting to deploy into the ground. So for 6 months, it was a very, very intensive soldiering period.
And when you say deploy, I mean, for those people listening, you've got your equipment, you've got your packs, all that, and you just go and live out or do you come back to camp?
No, we could be out on the hills because in South Armagh, a very, very hilly part of the area in Northern Ireland, right on the border.
Beautiful.
Southern Ireland. Oh, absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
If you're into hill walking, it's a beautiful country.
Yeah.
But when you're hill walking with your rifle, your burger and your backpack, and you're out there for 3-4 days at a time on patrol, it's quite intensive.
Yeah.
And of course, unlike conventional warfare, you can't see the enemy. Somebody in a shirt and tie, somebody in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt could be a sniper.
Yeah.
And you don't know until they open fire.
And historically, that happened a lot in that particular part of Northern Ireland.
It did happen a hell of a lot. During that tour, we lost 3 people that were actually blown up by an IED.
How do you cope with that as a serving soldier? And this is I ask this question of people that have been through a similar situation, but how do you cope with that when tomorrow or within half an hour you've got to be back out doing your job? How does that affect you?
Do you know what? I think it just comes down to training, because once you join the army and the whole training ethos is potentially you are going to die or you're going to lose friends. So when it happens, whilst it's a great shock and it's really terrible, I think the training, because it's so robust, prepares you for it. You'll never, ever get over the fact that a friend has just been killed.
No.
But you still know there's a job to do and you've got to go and do it, because if you don't, other friends are going to die, potentially. So you just literally get over it, put your kit on, and off you go and do it again.
And I've policed in Colchester and what have you. And I was always amazed that people took grave umbrage when soldiers would fight each other, because we've just trained them to fight. They come back and they're scrapping the town or they're scrapping the doorman or whatever. We had one incident where one of the doormen said something to one of the rear guard in the Paris about hopes all his mates get killed or something like that. Of course, when they all came back, they went and squared away the doorman.
Yeah.
And there seemed to be a great shock and surprise, but actually these are fit fighting people, and that's what they do, and that's why they've got robust military police and regimental police. South Armagh, as you say, is beautiful, and I think there's still undergoing a number of issues out there. I think there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get reported in the press, whether there's a press embargo. I'm not really sure, but it's the politics. It's going to go on and on forever, long after we've gone.
It's going to take generations to change. I mean, the mindset, no matter what people say, the mindset over there will not change for the next 30, 40 years.
No.
Because until all those old terrorists die off.
Yeah.
But of course, they're passing their bigoted views onto their children and their grandchildren. Yeah. So it's a tough call.
And that's on both sides of the fence.
Oh, absolutely. I've been back to Belfast several times since. Once with my wife for a view around the Titanic Museum.
Oh, lovely.
Belfast City Hall. While we were there, the Christmas markets were on. Probably one of the scariest moments of my life. The very first time I've been in Northern Ireland without a rifle in my hands. And we were stood at the Christmas market having a bite to eat and a pint. And all of a sudden behind me, this voice went, "Excuse me, is your name Davey Phillips?" At which point I bricked it, turned around, and stood behind me was a guy that I was in training with.
No.
That I hadn't seen in 35 years because I went to one unit, he went to another.
Wow.
And he recognised me, but there was just that moment where I thought, oh no, this is it.
We had a job that we ended up sending people out to Northern Ireland. They stayed in the Europa Hotel, which was famously the most bombed hotel in the world.
Yeah.
And they were in the pub opposite, and in walks this Northern Irish guy, and he'd obviously twigged on that these two people were coppers.
Yeah.
And there's a movie called In the Name of the Father. And he was played by the famous Northern Irish actor, but he was a human rights lawyer, and he was sitting there chatting to him, but very, very congenial, very very nice. But he was basically the mouthpiece for the terrorists in the courts. Yeah. But it's a beautiful place.
Northern Ireland is a beautiful, beautiful country. And we've been back several times since on weekend breaks. And it amazes me how friendly the people are, how lovely they are. But knowing full well, with my background, there's people there today who would quite happily put a bullet in the back of my head.
Yeah. And it's so small. That's what I couldn't come to terms with the tiny size of it, the scale of it was so small with so many problems. Yeah, it's a great place. So where did we go to from Northern Ireland?
Well, when I came back from Northern Ireland, I was sent on a career course, promotion course, because I'm now a full corporal and I'm looking at my sergeant. So I have to now go off and do education courses, which I did in Chatham down in Kent. So you do a 4-week education course, reading, writing, arithmetic, basic military stuff. And I then went off to be a section commander in the anti-tank platoon. At this stage, we're now using Milan anti-tank guided weapons. So it's still anti-tank, but they're now wire-guided missiles as opposed to big, heavy bombs. And I went off and did that and did quite well on the course, got a distinction, and was recommended to come back as instructor within the School of Infantry, which, of course, if I took that decision, it meant I had to re-badge. So I had to go off and do a 6-month course and then transferred into the Small Arms School Corps.
Which is a very... how do we describe it? It's quite elite, isn't it? It's quite a...
I wouldn't say elite, specialist.
Specialist,
probably a nicer word. Yeah, it's because what they do, the Small Arms School Corps, wherever the British military serve, because it's tri-service, wherever the British military serve, you'll find one of us secreted away somewhere. And we are the British Army's training experts. I hate the term expert, but specialist in training the trainer. Now, everybody thinks the SASC are all snipers and sniper instructors and we're all brilliant at teaching weapons. We use weapons as a vehicle to teach people how to teach. Right. And many of us are first aid instructors, NBC instructors, and lots of other things. So it's taking junior NCOs and senior NCOs and, of course, officers and teaching them to teach weapons. We've got a very interesting system in the British Army where we have this training the trainer. So embedded into every unit, they have weapons instructors, they have NBC instructors, first aid instructors. So it's all inbuilt. So wherever the unit go in the world, they can train each other. So the theory is if a new weapon came out, a weapon instructor gets hold of the pamphlet, gets hold of the weapon, puts the two together, practices it, and then teach it to his soldiers. And that's what we do. And we then qualify people to be those weapons instructors. And as I say, we're all over the world. So anybody going through courses at Brecon, at Warminster, in my day at Netheravon, anti-tanks, Sandhurst, all of these people are getting qualification in weapons and ranges are qualified by us. Still, I think, the smallest corps in the Army, 150 people.
Really? So what's the definition of small arms? Because you've obviously got artillery, you've got the cannons and what have you, but where does a small arm sit?
Well, a small arm is described as anything that an infantry soldier can get his hands on. So whether it's a pistol, a rifle, machine gun, anti-tank guided weapon, mortar, a chain gun on a Radin cannon. Yep. So any weapon system that a British Army soldier would use in war, we can train him on.
There's quite a few weapons that are covered by that.
A lot. But that's what I say, we only, on our courses, we would teach one pistol, one rifle, one machine gun, because the theory of teaching a rifle is exactly the same whatever the rifle. Yeah. And of course, it comes to its own when you go out to foreign countries working with foreign armies, where you can now use their weapons because you've got your inbuilt trainers.
And are their weapons unique, or do they go, if you go to, I know you worked in the Oman and we'll come on to that, but do they use different weaponry there, or is it all the...
Yeah, completely different weapons. And most armies, some armies will use the same weapons as us, some don't. For instance, when I worked over in Kenya for a while, their rangers were still using the old SLR, which was the weapon I first learned to shoot with. So it was quite interesting to go back to using a weapon that I first saw in 1979.
And then we use SA-80s.
We use SA-80 at the moment, yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I went to... when I was still in the police, I went to Quantico, and they've got a huge, it's a museum, but it's a ballistics training and testing centre. And I held the rifle that they'd used for the ballistic test for the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, right.
And the guns that John Dillinger had in his final shootout, and Pretty Boy Floyd. And they all get fired. They all get taken onto the range. I mean, it was boys' own stuff, but it's amazing. I'm not into guns, I'll be honest with you. I've got a shotgun and what have you. But it's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, I mean, we have down in Warminster, which is my old headquarters, we have a weapons collection. And in there is normally the first edition of every single weapon ever issued to the British Army. And there's lots of other pieces that have been captured in Northern Ireland, captured in various wars. And many of those weapons still fire today. So every year they have to be recertificated. So during our annual reunions, we go down there, take all the weapons out, take them out on the range, and we're firing black powder, we're firing machine guns, Lewis, Bren guns. It's brilliant. A brilliant day out.
I remember we had the old 303s when I was in the Army Cadets. That was the old 303s. It's superb. So how long were you in the school? How long were you?
Well, I stayed in the SASC for the rest of my career.
Right.
Because once you rebadge, that was me leaving the Irish Rangers, complete rebadge. I'm now Small Arms School Corps, and then spent the rest of my career traveling around training people. And the really unusual, it's like a bit like being in the job in the police. I think one of the unusual things is I enjoy teaching. And of course, the higher up the ranks you go, the less teaching you do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you now started to control people and manage people and doing centralized lectures rather than on the shop floor in the classroom teaching the students. But that's part of
rank
the career.
It has its privileges and its disadvantages as well.
Absolutely. So the one thing I really love doing, I did less and less of the higher up the ranks I went.
Where was the most exotic place that you served?
Exotic? Probably Oman. There was a newly created post. I was working down in Warminster at the time as the SMI training, so Warrant Officer Class 1, Sergeant Major Instructor, in charge of support weapons training for the British Army.
Yeah.
And a new job was created over in Oman in the Sultan Military Academy. And what they had there was they had 3 instructors, British Army instructors, a mortar instructor, a small arms instructor, and an explosives. And they couldn't afford to keep paying for 3 people. And it was one of our previous commanding officers was out in Oman having a conference, and he said, well, instead of having 3 colour sergeants, why don't I give you 1 SMI who's qualified in all 3? And it saves money. Yes, I'm more expensive as W1, but I'm certainly not the same price as 3 colour sergeants.
No.
So this new post came up. And of the 18 people, I think, that were qualified to go, 1 applied. Me. And the reason being is that by the time you're an SMI, you're coming to the end of your career.
Yes.
And you either are leaving or you are going to commission. And I was told that if I applied for this role, I would be missing out on a commission because they couldn't send me out there. And then 6 months later, I get commissioned and brought back. So I had to sort of make a decision. Do I commission or do I go out there and have my final 2.5 years living in Oman, having a very nice job, an interesting job? And I chose the latter. And whilst I was out there, strangely enough, I then went on to a different career path where, because of my background and qualifications, I was asked to extend in the army for another 15 years.
Wow.
Which I did for 2 years.
I was going to say. Did you pick up again after that?
No, because I was already now at the top rank. So I can't be promoted anywhere after that. So I had to give up my potential commission to go and do that job. And then in my last 6 months there, I then was offered a continuation career, what we used to call long service list. So you then get 15-year extra career in 5-year increments.
Right. Okay.
And that's what I went on to.
So what year was that?
That was in 2003. I came back from Oman, having spent 2.5 years working in the Sultan's military academy.
Very nice. There are worse jobs in the world, Sarah.
It was a really, really, very similar to, if you imagine, for those that know the army, it's like taking Sandhurst at Officer Training School, Brecon at Tactics School, and Warminster at Support Weapons School, and putting them all in the same place. So it was a very, very interesting and very varied role, because I would be looking at officer training, NCO training in all of the specialist weapons, machine guns, mortars, sniping, and basic infantry skills. And so from a career point of view, it's a really interesting place to work, but a very frustrating place to work as well, because Arabs don't like changing things. So it's very, very difficult to get them to change their minds and do something slightly differently, which is better. And it took me a long time to realize that the best way of doing it was to show them the difference it would make. Then they would say, okay, leave that with us. And then one of their officers would come up with the idea and we would change, having seen me do it. And it's a very frustrating job, but it was like going back 20 years or 30 years in the British Army training and then trying to move it 30 years forward in a space of 2.5 years.
And we only have to look at what's happening in Qatar at the moment with the, yes, you can do it 1 minute, no, you can't do it the next. And they've got a completely different mindset.
Oh, very much so.
Were you out there during the Gulf War? What was going on?
Gulf War II started just before I left.
Right, okay.
So I was getting ready to leave when the Second Gulf War kicked off. And of course, one of the conversations I had with my wife is that potentially, being a fluent Arabic speaker, I'd be sent out to the Gulf to help with translating and, of course, training and building ranges or whatever. But the British Army decided to send me to Sennybridge in South Wales to be in charge of a range complex.
It's bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how long were you at Sennybridge?
2 years. And I actually, whilst there, I think because we had such an unusual job in Oman, coming back to normal work in the British Army became not difficult, but it was frustrating. And I started to lose my love of the job. So I decided it was time to look for something else and applied for 5 jobs, one of which was the Tower of London, and had 5 job interviews and chose the Tower of London because I love history. And it was something that was so unique and so different and completely away from the army, a bit like the time I spent in Oman, that we decided to give this a go. And I've been here since September 2005.
And it is a great place. I still get goosebumps as I walk through that gate. And I've been very privileged, and that is the right word, to come here on a number of occasions. I've been to weddings, I've been to New Year's Eve, and I still get a buzz out of coming here.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I live here. I've lived here 17 years. And I still occasionally, when I'm walking back from meeting friends in town, and you come around the corner, you see the White Tower all lit up at night. It's just beautiful. And I don't think anybody will ever get bored of seeing that view and thinking, that's my home.
Yeah. And the fact that when we leave the bar, but when you leave the bar and you walk down these empty streets, and these are the streets where every king and queen of England has been since 1066. It's it's an amazing place. And when you go into the chapel and you've got the crypt St Thomas More and all the things that go with it, you go and see the crown jewels. You can't quantify this as a package. It's the most, and you, dare I say it, as a beefeater here, you are the most iconic sites in London, because you only have to, I get off the plane at Heathrow and I see pictures of beefeaters, or if I'm getting on, I see pictures of beefeaters. Everybody flocks here, and some days, I mean, the numbers of people that you have here are huge.
They are. I mean, we can be, certainly pre-COVID, the height of the summer season, we can have 17,000, 18,000 in a day in the Tower of London. And I have met people from all over the world and had the privilege of interpreting history for them. You know, as a young lad growing up in the East End of London who used to play in the Tower of London as a child, because when I was a child, it was free to come into the grounds.
Was it really?
And then you paid a separate entry to go into each building. And of course, I used to run around climbing on the cannons, annoying the hell out of these grumpy old beefeaters. Never realising 40 years later, karma would bite me in the backside.
Yeah.
And I'd be shouting at the kids to get off the cannons.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I always remember I was talking to you, and there was an American, and you said to them, where are you from? And they said, America. You said, I did American as a degree. It's the best 2 weeks I've spent.
Yeah, you can have a lot of fun. And I think 99.9% of people take it the way it's meant. It's a bit of fun.
Yeah,
and
they do.
Because history at school for me was a boring, dry, awful subject. I really hated history. And it was only as I grew up and started traveling the world with the military, I got a real interest in history. And I personally like social history. You know, why do people dress like that? Yeah. Why do they eat that food? Why do they live in that style of house? And I love that. So given the opportunity to talk about our British history to people from all over the world is a wonderful privilege.
Yeah, it's a great place. And of course, you came here 2005, and then you joined the Special Constabulary. Yeah,
after a couple of years here, I'll be honest, I missed the adrenaline of being in the army. So I was looking for something else. And I've done voluntary work my whole military career in my spare time. And I was looking for something to do here. And we had a presentation by a special chief inspector, and it sounded quite interesting. So I applied, went off to Hendon in 2009, did my training, and then became a special constable in February 2009.
And where did you serve? Where have you served? Because you're still serving, but so where have you served as special?
Well, I started off for the first 5 years, I was in the local Safer Neighbourhood team. So St Catherine's and Wapping, where I sort of did my street duties, as is known today, where I learned the trade, if you like, of being a police officer on the ground. Had some fantastic people, you know, really worked with a good team of guys. And the skipper in particular was on the ball, you know, sort of coaching, mentoring, because I'm out there on the streets with police officers who are younger than my youngest son.
Yeah.
But of course, they've been police officers for 5, 6, 7 years. I'm the new boy, even though I'm old enough to be their fathers. So really, really good learning that sort of trade craft. And after 5 years, I moved across to the counter-terrorism patrol unit.
Interesting.
A friend of mine had moved across from the team into there, and after about a year, he said, look, there's an opening up here. Based on your military background, this might be quite interesting. So I went across, had a word with the skipper over there, the sergeant, and he just basically said, why don't you come along, do a few duties, see if you like it, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So I spent the next 7 years working with counter-terrorism.
So what year did you go into that?
That was 2015.
Okay. That's interesting though, because a lot of things have happened. I interviewed a guy yesterday who was part of the 7-7 mortuary team or whatever. But we, as a nation, we professionalise the way that we investigate counter-terrorism, the way that we not only investigate, but we try and prevent it from happening. We've really developed we've got a class act. I think we're probably, I would say, wouldn't I, but probably the best in the world when it comes to the sorts of things that we can do.
Yeah, because I think that the biggest thing with counter-terrorism is to deter.
Yeah.
And then afterwards detect. But if you can deter it before it even happens, you're saving lives. And it's really strange because you will do duties, and you'll know this, but you'll do things that deter a potential terrorist attack, and you'll never know you've deterred it. It just doesn't happen. So, of course, you can't quantify what you've done.
But I think what's also lost by some of the public is, yes, it is counterterrorism, but actually it's community, because actually, dare I say it, we've got people that are plotting against the government, the infrastructure, the authorities. They live in the community, and therefore you need to have those strong community links in order to do the preventative stuff.
Yeah.
And the other thing that engagement brings information, intelligence, which then becomes actionable, when you're able then to take it even further and drill into it to prevent it. Generations we're looking at, because some groups, some community groups it's ingrained. The battle is ingrained in them, and they'll look for the soft targets. Yeah,
I think you're quite right, because as soon as you say terrorism, most people automatically think of Islamic terrorists. But as you say, to a degree, Just Stop Oil that we're having at the moment. Yeah. Getting people in there, find that information, find out where they're planning to disrupt our lives, and stop it before it happens. As is happening every single day. People just don't see it.
No.
But it's happening every single hour of every day that people are out there talking to the communities. To be honest, to me, walking the beat as a police officer is very much like walking Northern Ireland, walking the streets of Northern Ireland. You're engaging with the community. Some people don't want to be seen to be talking to a uniformed person. But if you can get them talking, it's amazing the amount of intelligence you gather just from talking to local people.
Absolutely. And it's the same as walking out here, because some people will come into the Tower of London under duress. There'll be the grumpy dad who didn't really want to come with the kids, but it's about getting them to smile and be part and parcel of what's actually taking place here.
Absolutely. I've always got a theory, maybe it's because I'm a father, a grandfather, but when I see that situation, that family that are really, you can see the stress they're under, because they've just had to get up early, feed the kids, get on a train, come to London, and just take that pressure away by talking to the kids, engaging the children, because if the children are happy, invariably the parents are happy.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you can do that, if you can just make those kids smile, you can see the whole family change.
So if you were Dave, aged 16, what advice would you give yourself now? If you were sitting there with somebody who's thinking, I'm going to go and join the army, I'm 16 years old, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them to actually go for it. Do it. I have this conversation regularly with visitors, with family, with friends, with their children that are grown up and thinking of joining the military. I wouldn't say join the army, I would say join the military. It is a fantastic career. I got to see things and do things that the average person would never ever see in their lifetime, and had a very good career out of it. And it turned me from a 16-year-old boy from the East End of London into a man that has travelled internationally, has got a wealth of experience and knowledge, and it led to me being here. Without that military career, I couldn't have been here. And I don't think there's many things I would have changed. Don't get me wrong, we all have bad days at work, but there's not many things I would have changed that I've done.
And what have the highlights been? What have the high points been? I mean, you've said you met Her Majesty the Queen. I mean, that is, for me, I absolutely adored her. I was privileged enough to be at an event and with about 50 other people, and she came walking through the crowd. Good evening, good evening.
Well, I think that's always going to be special, meeting the Queen or the King. Now, I have to say, I've not yet met the King as the King.
No. Have you met him? Did you meet him as the Prince of Wales?
I've met him many times as the Prince of Wales. I had dinner with him some years ago.
Did you really?
Yeah, along with 500 other people.
Well,
but I had dinner over in Sandhurst. We used to have, while I was still serving the army, a Warrant Officers Convention. So all Warrant Officer Class 1s in the Army would go together for a study period to find out where the British Army's going, what we're doing, and it would finish with a big regimental dinner, and he was the guest of honour at dinner. Lovely man. I've spoken to him on several occasions. Very funny story, actually, with Prince Charles. He was 2019, he came to the Tower of London and brought with him all the regalia when he was inaugurated as Prince of Wales, and it's now on display in the Crown Jewels. And he wanted a very informal picture with the Yeoman Warders. So we were just stood on Tower Green in front of the King's house, Queen's house then, in a semicircle. And the idea was he was just going to walk out, turn around, look up at the balcony, a nice informal photograph. And then he said, I want the Yeoman Warders just to crowd around me and I'll have a chat with them. And he walked out of the Queen's house. There was probably 30 Yeoman Warders all stood there in our state dress, our red ceremonial uniform, with probably about 200 medals between us. And he walked straight over towards me. And as he came towards me, he said, that medal you're wearing is from Oman. And he recognised that one medal, that one medal ribbon. And I said, yes, sir. I'd served in Oman for 2.5 years. And he started speaking Arabic to me.
Did he really?
Which blew my mind.
Wow.
So I replied because I once spoke fluent Arabic. So we started having this conversation in Arabic. And after about, 4 or 5 sentences, he sort of went, right, that's it. You've beaten me. That's all I know. But it just blew my mind that not only did he recognise that one medal that I was given by Sultan Qaboos, but he spoke to me in Arabic. And it's little things like that, I think, that just show you how clever this guy is and just what he's done in his life.
I agree.
Yeah. I've got a lovely photograph, actually, of him smiling at me, speaking Arabic to him.
That's fantastic. And these are money can't buy situations.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of friends here, and I know that you get to some very, very interesting places, the embassies in London, what have you. You can't just walk into these places off the street. And you are instantly recognisable. And I always remember Steve McMenemy, before he went off to the States, he went to a theatre, and I think it was either Bradley Walsh or Joe Pasquale. And when they started talking, he said, what do you do? Joe Pasquale, whoever it was, said, what do you do? He said, I'm a beefeater. And it was absolutely wrapped with the fact that he was a beefeater. Yeah. And Steve couldn't understand it. I said, but the fact is that if you had your uniform on, your state dress, everybody will know that you're a beefeater. If Bradley Walsh or Joe Pasquale walks into a restaurant in New York dressed as they are, well, guess what? No one's going to know who they are. Yeah. And that's the difference. This was 32, 34 of you now. 34
of us now.
34 now. Yeah. It was 37, and then there were
we lost a few to redundancy during COVID.
And you are all instantly recognisable. They might not remember your face, but guess what? That uniform.
Yeah, it's iconic.
Yeah, it is iconic. And how old is that uniform?
Well, the state dress dates from 1485, the red uniform. Our working dress, blue undress, that only dates from 1853. So it's fairly new. Well, as I always say to our American friends, it's very, very old. But to English people, it's fairly new.
Yeah. So is that Charles II, the state?
No, it comes from Henry VII.
Henry VII.
Yeah. Originally, the uniform was green.
But
it was changed to red because in those days, the most expensive colours to make were purple, red and blue. So, of course, the monarchy still wear purple. And by putting us in blue and red, you're basically saying, look at me, how powerful I am, how wealthy I am. I can even put my servants in the best quality clothing. So that's why I've always worn that colour. And I was just thinking while you were talking there about instantly recognisable. Judith, my wife, and I, some years ago, were at a comedy show in Leicester Square. And the warm-up act came on. And he said something along the lines of, just to get you all going, whoever's got the most interesting job in this room, I'm going to buy a round for. So he said, if you've got an interesting job, put your hand up. So I put my hand up along with, 50 other people. And he went around questioning. Eventually, after several questions, there were 2 people left with their hand up, me and another guy. So he said to this other guy, so what do you do for a living? He said, I'm a personal bodyguard. Oh, right, who for? He said, I'm really sorry, I can't tell you, but suffice it to say, it's a Hollywood star. And he went, wow. And he looked around at me, he said, beat that. I said, I'm a bodyguard as well. Who for? Her Majesty the Queen. I wandered around the drinks. And not only that, but when I wandered around the drinks, I went to the bar to buy it, and the bodyguard came over, shook my hand and said, mate, that's brilliant. And he bought me around the drinks as well. So yeah,
it is,
as you say, it's instantly recognisable.
Yeah, it is absolutely brilliant. And I absolutely love it here. And it's not only here, but it's the history that's wrapped around the place as well.
Yeah.
Your Tower Hill, the Tower Bridge, all iconic sites. HMS Belfast out on the water. It's just, I love London and I enjoy coming in here.
Yeah, I mean, just because this house was bombed in the Second World War, when he rebuilt it, because the back, the part we're now sitting in, was actually destroyed. It fell into the moat. So when they rebuilt it, very unusually, I've got the only house in the outer wall with windows. So from my kitchen window, you can actually see the Roman city wall. So that just looking out my kitchen window, I'm looking at something that's 2,000 years old.
That is brilliant.
And all those iconic buildings up on Tower Hill, the Gherkin, the Port of London Authority building. It's not just where I'm sitting, it's all, as you say, all around us. We're surrounded by history.
So what's next in Dave's life? What's
retirement. January next year, I'm retiring. Having been here 17 years, I think it's time for a change. We had always planned on leaving when I'm 60, which I'll be next month. That's been delayed slightly with the death of Her Majesty and trying to work out whether I'm going to stay for the coronation. And after about a month of thinking about it, we've decided, you know what, it's time to go. So retirement down to South Wales, my wife's hometown, and a bit more voluntary work.
Fantastic. And you do after dinners as well, don't you? You'll do after dinner speeches?
I do after dinner speaking, which I thoroughly enjoy doing. To be fair, most after dinner speaking I've done for friends and colleagues and for lots of charities. So, of course, I don't charge for it.
No.
Because all the money goes to a good cause.
Well, we're going to put all your links, anything that you want to put on, we'll put onto this podcast. If there's anything that you want us to share with people, please just let me know and I'll get it on there. Before we conclude this interview, is there anything you'd like to add, alter, correct, change?
No, I'm very happy. Just a nice conversation with an old friend.
Thank you.
Sorry, but a very old friend.
Very old friend. David, thank you so much for your time today. I wish you well, and I wish you well for the future. And I look forward to hearing what you're up to next.
Thanks very much.